When we throw privacy into the mix with security, then we have to start to look towards Linux and BSD type distributions. Although Windows and Mac are pretty solid for security, they are weak for privacy. I mentioned before SE Linux, but this is a Linux kernel only, not a complete distribution, and we really need a distribution. Linux and BSD type distributions are going to give you security and privacy, but you're going to have to sacrifice interoperability and usability. Like, you won't be able to use Photoshop or Microsoft Office, but there are, of course, alternatives to use within these operating systems. But also, I'm perhaps casting too much of a dark shadow, because it's actually possible to use multiple operating systems without too much hassle, and I'll show you how to do that. There are 3 standard distributions I recommend for modest security and privacy needs. These are Debian, OpenBSD, and Arch Linux. Some of you may not be too up to speed with any other laptop operating system other than Windows and possibly Apple Mac OS X. Briefly, if you're not aware, there are many operating systems that have evolved in some way from the mid-1960s operating system called Unix, including my recommended Debian, OpenBSD, and Arch Linux. And just quickly to get you up to speed, you can see here the Unix Linux history tree, and right at the top there is Unix. So if we zoom in a little bit, and we can see here starting in the 1960s with the Unix type operating systems. And then these have eventually evolved into other operating systems. Here you can see BSD, which is where OpenBSD came from. And then you have the beginning of Linux. Linux is a completely free piece of software started by Linus and supported by thousands of programmers worldwide. So if you go further down, and we can see more and more. And here we get to Debian, which is another one that I recommended. An offshoot of Linux would be things like Android that you'd be familiar with, Chrome OS. Interestingly, you can also see Apple Mac OS X here, which is a derivative from BSD. So all of these would be Unix-like operating systems, and they're really Unix-like operating systems and NT. And Windows is different to all these because it is based on the NT kernel, which was developed by Microsoft. When you see the desktops of these Unix-like operating systems, the desktop is based on the desktop environment that has been chosen, and most often you can actually change that to one that you prefer. Examples of these desktop environments include GNOME, KDE, X, FCE, Mate, Cinnamon, and LXDE. And try not to be afraid of these Unix-type operating systems. They are different, but you can get to grips with them if you're persistent. If you're familiar with Mac OS X, that, as you can see, is a BSD derivative, so you'll be somewhat familiar with the command line interface.